It's late evening, November 2nd, 1856. The French passenger steamship Le Lyonnais plows through the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Just a day out of New York, its 132 passengers and crew are bound for Le Havre, France, and most have settled into their cabins for the night. The weather is pleasant, albeit cold, and there is nothing worse than a light chop to contend with. For November in the North Atlantic, it certainly could be a lot worse. The crew on watch expect a gentle and uneventful night. Crewman Jean-Marie Louis Chapot slowly slinks into his bunk. On either side of him is another crewman, so close he could reach out and touch them, and certainly close enough to hear them snoring. Every inch of his body aches, and all he can think about is closing his eyes and getting a few hours of sleep. Despite the creaking of the ship and the tight quarters, he is asleep within seconds. After about an hour, which seemed like just seconds to him, Chapot slowly opens his eyes. He heard something, and felt something, like a crushing thud, but in the foggy haze of sleep, he wasn't sure if it was real or a dream. Nothing to worry about, he says to himself, and he closes his eyes again. He knew he probably should go investigate, just to be sure, but sleep is his only master at the moment. Suddenly, the boatswain comes screaming into the room. "Get up, boys, we're run into." Chapot leapt out of his bunk, as did his shipmates, and began scrambling around. Firemen ran to the engine room, while Chapot and others ran to the deck. Someone shouted, "The ship is sinking," but he could not yet see what was the matter. As he approached a group of sailors standing at the portside rail, he heard them talking. A sailing ship had rammed them, and in the distance, through the mist, Chapot could make out the silhouette of the ship. It was a bark, and he recognized the shape. He shook his head and mumbled under his breath, "American." The Adriatic Affair, a maritime hit and run off the coast of Nantucket, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. I'm very happy to welcome back friend of the podcast, Jennifer Sellitti. Jen, it's great to see you again, and thanks for being here today.
So great to see you too, Rich. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Now, you are a public defender and co-owner and operator of the dive vessel Tenacious. You are a licensed boat captain and now a published author. So, is there anything you can't do? I'm wondering, am I missing anything?
Oh, you're too kind. It does keep me really busy. I always say that I have a full-time job and a very aggressive hobby, but fortunately I have a partner that does all of this with me, and it's all labors of love, I have to say.
Yeah. And I can tell that from your writing, of course. And we're going to discuss Joe and the rest of your team a little bit later when we get into how you found the wreck. But listeners may remember that you joined me previously for the episodes on the wrecks of the U-53 and the return to the Andrea, both of which are fantastic episodes and shows your passion for finding these wrecks and visiting them, making sure they're not forgotten. So I think that's what I appreciate about your work so much. But today we're going to discuss the Adriatic Affair, which is the title of your new book. We're going to get into the whole story, of course, but could you give us just a quick synopsis for listeners before we jump in, kind of at a high level?
Sure. So the Adriatic Affair is the story of the collision between the 1855 passenger steamship Le Lyonnais, it was a French passenger steamship, and an American sailing vessel called Adriatic. And the two collided off the coast of Nantucket on November 1st, 1856. And I always say it's sort of two stories in one because it is the story of a collision and sinking and ultimately survival of a shipwreck. But then it doesn't end there. And there's a very interesting story about the aftermath of the shipwreck that very much shaped maritime law and history. And in some ways, it becomes sort of a court case, a legal story, in addition to being a shipwreck story.
Yeah, and some really fantastic things happen in the story, which we're going to talk about. Now, I've read the whole book, and it is, of course, fantastic. And I'm sincerely saying that. I'm not just saying that because, because you're on the show, but it's one of the best books I've read in several years.
Thank you.
beautifully written. Honestly, I couldn't get over the way that you describe things so vividly, and you could almost feel like you were there. Now, the subsequent aftermath of the wreck itself is interesting, of course, along with the consequences of the actual shipwreck. But I can't wait to get into that. And the research that you did is mind-blowing. Of course, I had to read through your bibliography, so I was looking at all
I'm
these.
glad somebody did.
Well, I'm always looking for sources for things, so I was looking through where you got all of this information, and I was just blown away. I mean, that's an incredible list of sources. So and it must have taken a long time, which brings me to, how did you get involved in this story?
So I started my interest in shipwrecks and my interest in diving and all of that stuff started maybe 10 years ago when I met my partner, Joe Mazraani, who is the captain and owner of DV Tenacious. And when I met him, I'm not from a seafaring family. When I met him, I was not, doing any of this stuff. But I was always really interested in history, legal history, in the history of, and even in maritime history, and started to get really interested in the stories of the shipwrecks, not necessarily from the perspective of iron and metal and steel and that kind of stuff, but more interested in the people who lived and died aboard these ships. Whenever I would hear about a shipwreck disaster, or hear him talking about a wreck he was diving, I would say to myself, wow, there were people on that wreck the moment that it happened. So whether they lived or died, there's a story there. And for every person aboard a ship, there's a story. So that kind of got me into it. And then one day I said very naively, can I help find a shipwreck? And the Lyonnais just happened to be the first wreck that Joe mentioned. So I often say that the story of finding it is a story of both luck and love. It was luck that he mentioned the Lyonnais, that was just the first ship that popped into his head. And it really, the more research I did on it and the more I talked to the team about their previous efforts to find it, it was like the more I fell in love with him, the more I fell in love with the shipwreck and vice versa. And that kind of set me off on a career, on a path of doing everything I could to help find it, including learning how to dive, getting my captain's license, doing everything that I could to help contribute to this project and this search for this lost ship.
As you're doing all of this research to find the wreck, when did you decide you were going to write the book?
So I had started amassing all this information about the wreck, and I would go down rabbit holes, right? I'd find out about somebody who was on board the wreck. I would search their name. I would try to find out information about them. And I would come home and I would say, Joe, you'll never believe it. Today I found out that, Reverend Augustus Froelich taught at the University of Troy and he was on the ship, and he'd be like, great, that's not going to help us find it. So I divided all of my research then into two categories. I had two folders on my computer, one that said stuff that will help us find it, and the other was interesting stuff. And eventually the interesting stuff folder started to get so big, and I started to feel so invested and so connected to the characters that I was reading about, to the people that I was reading about, that I said, I just have to do something with this. And I kind of started writing chapters here and there, and then eventually I said, there's enough here for a book, and got serious about looking for a publisher and going down that road. But the interesting thing about all of this is there came a point at which the stuff that help us find it and the interesting stuff kind of converged, because towards the end of our search for the wreck, we had to make decisions that kind of involved who we thought might have a motive to testify falsely or to underestimate how far they were from shore. And we made some big decisions about where to search based on a very in-depth knowledge of the people involved and what their motivations might have been. And it really turned out to the stuff that we didn't think was going to help us find the wreck actually helped us find the wreck in the end.
Yeah, give us a little background about each of the ships, the Adriatic and Le Lyonnais.
So the Lyonnais was built in France in 1856. And even the name, in French, people know that French le means the. So people have said, why are you calling it the Lyonnais? But we actually were able to go back through historical archives and records and find out that that was actually the name of the ship, and it was done purposefully. So she was built in England, in Birkenhead, England, by Laird, which is now Canal Laird. It's a company that's still in business. in 1855, 1855, launched in January of 1856. And she was launched by a company called Franco-American, which were two brothers who in the 1850s were trying to get into the transatlantic passengers trade. This was a time when, Collins and Cunard were competing to kind of conquer the Atlantic, but there were a number of smaller players trying to enter the market. And they sought to be the French provider of passenger steamship travel between Le Havre, France, and New York. They also had 5 other ships. So she was one of 6 sisters, 5 other ships that were also engaged in various passenger travel between ports in Spain and France and places like Cuba and South America, as well as New York. But Le Lyonnais' primary purpose was to go from New York and Le Havre carrying passengers in what in the 1850s would have been luxury passenger travel. The Adriatic was a ship built in 1855 for Durham and Company, which was a company out of Belfast, Maine. Captain Jonathan Durham came from one of the original founding families of Belfast, Maine. He and his father had this ship commissioned along with his brother Charles, and the point of this ship was going to be to deliver lumber from the United States to ports around the world. Belfast, Maine, obviously known for timber, known for lumber, prized lumber for building masts in particular. And his brother Charles, it was Charles Durham and Jonathan Durham. Jonathan was the seafarer and his brother Charles was a lumber dealer, and their father essentially bankrolled the building of the ship, the Adriatic. And it was interestingly, it was both of these ships' first voyage of purpose that they collided. It was Adriatic's first voyage, and it was Le Lyonnais' first time carrying passengers from New York to Le Havre when this incident occurred.
Where did the trouble come into play?
So it was on the evening of November 2nd, 1856. So Le Lyonnais left New York for Le Havre on November 1st. I believe it was the 31st that Adriatic left. It was going to Savannah, Georgia. And it was on the evening of November 2nd that the two collided, roughly 200 miles from New Bedford, is where our launch point is, in an area known as George's Bank, which is an area that is out sort of near the continental shelf. So that was where the collision took place. The weather wasn't particularly bad. They say starlight but hazy, so tolerable weather. It was really a matter of, this was a time when there weren't really many rules of the road at sea, and there certainly weren't international rules of the road at sea. It was common practice for sailing vessels, for steamships to yield to sailing vessels, as it is today. But there weren't very many steamships on the ocean. This is just the beginning of sort of the age of steam. So there weren't a lot of instances where these two kind of vessels were approaching each other like this. So the best way to describe it is that Adriatic assumed that the steamship was going to hang back and allow the Adriatic to pass at the bow. The steamship thought that the other ship was going to come and pass them at the stern, essentially. At the last minute, the Lyonnais tried to make a turn, and at the last minute, Adriatic pulled their sails, so the sails went dead. And at that point, neither could avoid the collision. So the Adriatic kind of stove the Lyonnais in the side in like this T-shaped sort of a collision, punched 2 holes in the Lyonnais' stern, which caused her to start to sink, and she sank slowly by the stern over the course of the next couple of days.
And being an American ship, they didn't have to have a light on board, even though they probably did, it seems like from the evidence. And most sailing ships probably did anyway, even though they didn't have to. But the Lyonnais was French, and French law said they did have to have a light, which they did. And that came into question later during the legal aspect of the story when there's a trial. In your opinion, what do you think happened there? Was it obvious that the Adriatic had a light, or do you question that?
I do question it. And, it's funny, you mentioned that I'm an attorney, I'm a criminal defense attorney. And one of the things you do at a trial, right, is you reconstruct what happened at the time a crime took place or an accident took place. And, as you go back, you often look at people's first statements, like the things they say first before they have real motives to fabricate. And nobody aboard the Adriatic mentions hoisting a light, which is a pretty big deal if you're about to make a collision and you take the time, about to collide with another ship, and you take the time to find a light and hoist it. you would probably mention that. So it's sort of an admission by omission, that they probably didn't have a light or they didn't raise the light very high. You also had the sailors on the Lyonnais who were very used to seeing lights. They're accustomed to looking out for lights at night, who said, we didn't see any lights. We didn't see this ship until it was bearing down under us under full sail, and it was too late to avoid the ship by turning. So, it's always difficult. You will never really know what happened, but you kind of have to look to initial evidence before people had the motive to fabricate. So I do think that the Adriatic probably had a light somewhere and may have even hoisted it, but very likely hoisted it way too late for the Lyonnais to see and do anything about it and turn to avoid the collision in time. Not to say that they weren't also partially at fault, because it is true they should have yielded to a sailing vessel that's coming full speed on the wind, because a sailing vessel does not have quite the ability to control itself the way a steamship can. So there were certainly mistakes made on both sides.
And I think for me, one of the most interesting things about the case of who was at fault ultimately is what happened next, because neither ship seemed to stop to help the other, at least in their two perspectives. So tell us about that, about what happened next there after the collision.
So after the ships collided, immediately, it was kind of chaos on deck for the Lyonnais, because there was also, when the Adriatic pulled away, she left a lot of her foreworks on the Lyonnais' deck. So you can imagine debris all over the Lyonnais. The passengers all report hearing this loud thump, this, not a crash, but they describe it as this like dull, heavy thud. They knew something had happened. And so they're all coming out to figure out what's going on. They look over the side of the ship. They do see a small hole above the waterline. So it's kind of chaos. Down in the engine room of the Lyonnais, the water started seeping in almost immediately. So the engine got choked out in about 10 minutes. So after about 10 minutes, they lost any ability to move under the power of steam. But when you think about what that looks like on Adriatic's deck, right? Adriatic has now lost a bunch of its foreworks that is left behind on the Lyonnais' deck. They pull away. They're still afloat, but they have to stop to assess the damage. And to them, it looks like the Lyonnais just keeps going. They don't know that the Lyonnais is just traveling under its own inertia, that it's not really traveling under steam. Where I do think it gets interesting is that, the Lyonnais knew it was in trouble. It could not move under the power of steam, and there was a hole at the waterline and a suspicion that there was a hole below the waterline. They had on board a cannon and a steam whistle that they claimed that they blew all night. The Adriatic actually stopped nearby, kind of parked, for lack of a better term, right, threw an anchor, stopped, and waited until morning to fully assess the damage before going home. So the idea that they didn't hear those cannons firing and see those lights and hear that whistle, really strange, credibility. It's possible, but that's what they always said. We didn't know that Lyonnais was in trouble, and we were in enough trouble of our own that we didn't mount a search for the other ship. They even go as far as to say, well, we thought the steamship was going to come back and help us. So again, you got to look at it as a matter of perspective. Each side is going to have a very different perspective. When you're in an accident, you always think it's the other person's fault and that the other person should help you, right? So I think there was a lot of that going on out there that evening.
Yeah, in my opinion, when they decided the ship was in good enough condition that they could return back home, that's when they should have made an effort to find Le Lyonnais, because obviously they were still seaworthy. It was damaged, sure, but it wasn't in danger of sinking. And I just can't imagine that they didn't hear the whistle or the cannon. And I can't imagine that the Le Lyonnais would not have fired them and sounded the whistle, because they were in serious danger. Of course they're going to do it. So I don't doubt for a second that they did sound those signals. Now comes the tragic part. The Le Lyonnais was in a lot of trouble and starts to sink. So tell us about that sequence of it.
Yeah, so she's in trouble. She starts to sink. There's a moment of hope when they try to repair the hole above the waterline by listing the ship to port, to lift it. It's on the starboard side, to lift it above water. They manage to plug it up with a studding sail, but then they soon realize that the ship is filling with water too quickly. There's got to be a hole they can't reach. At that point, The captain puts everybody into the boats and tells the boats to stand by the ship all night. The idea being that somebody might pass by, everybody's together. The weather was not great. Everybody will stay together. Hopefully the weather will be better in the morning. We can assess the situation in the morning. Next morning comes, many of the people did not survive the first night because the weather was pretty violent. One of the boats got pulled into the ship and crashed. So throughout the night, people in one boat would hear like screaming and yelling coming from other boats. The next morning, there are 3 lifeboats and then 2 longboats, which were primarily the captain and the purser's boats, left. And the captain eventually sends those 3 boats off to sea. And they were not well provisioned. Most of the provisions, because the ship was sinking by the stern and most of the provisions were in the stern, the water was all full of salt water. Most of the food was ruined. Food stores were ruined. So you have to remember, when people are finally getting into these boats, it had already been since dinner the night before. So as the collision was the evening of November 2nd, they're doing all of this bailing and trying to save the ship on the 3rd. They get into the boats on the evening of the 3rd, and it's not till the morning of the 4th that they even start to get on the way on their journey in the open sea, in the North Atlantic, in November, in weather that was not moderating, in weather that was building very quickly, freezing cold temperatures, and in, 1856 clothing, which is just not the same as it is today. So the situation became pretty dire pretty quickly.
One of the most heartbreaking things was reading what happened to the makeshift raft that they built, and they were trying to put the excess passengers and crew on this. It was barely seaworthy, and not really seaworthy at all. It just barely stayed afloat. And there were passengers too. These weren't all crew. Not that one's more important than the other, but the passengers obviously aren't used to this and aren't prepared for this and don't have the skills to really help much.
Yeah, it was, it was a time when, I always say to people, tell me if you've heard this before, there weren't enough lifeboats for everybody on board, right? It's not until the early 20th century that we start to see the lifeboat regulations coming in, having to do with how many people you have on board. And that was by design. So, some people think that these ships were derelict or they were just trying to save money. There was actually, and I talk about it in the book, like there was actually publications in Britain and in France that talked about it being a hazard, because these are not inflatable life rafts, right? These are big wooden rowboats that hold like 20 people. The more of them that you shove on a deck, the less room there is up top, the more they are obstructions to view. They could also impact the stability of the ship. So there were regulations that said you can't have excess lifeboats. And because the Lyonnais wasn't carrying as many passengers as she could, it was her first voyage, she wasn't full. They actually had enough room in the lifeboats for all but 50 passengers. And the embarkation of these lifeboats was very orderly. It was very calm. And part of the reason for that is the crew. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the crew were all soldiers. Like, these were men of discipline. These were people that were coming. Most of them were French sailors who had just finished serving in the Crimean War in the French Navy. So you don't hear the kind of horror stories that we hear from other ships. And I'm thinking of the Arctic and the Vesta, right? From other shipwrecks in the East where you have like women and children last, right? Mass chaos. But they did their best, and the captain did his best to make sure that every lifeboat had a good complement of women, of men, of passengers, of crew, so that the workload could be balanced, that the theory was that the lifeboats would have a combination of strength and able seamen. But as boats started sinking, many of the people who wound up on the raft were just unlucky that their boat went down during the night and there was nowhere to go but the raft. But yeah, it's a tragedy, all of these boats, but this idea of this like poorly constructed raft being tethered to the ship and just being there one day with 30 or so people on it, screaming for help all night, and then the next morning it's gone.
And, it didn't sink quickly, within minutes or anything. So it was a pretty drawn out process. And like you said, the captain was trying to divvy everybody up equally and put people here and there and mix them up by male or female and crew or passenger. But of course, eventually it did sink. And I thought it was interesting that what was it, about a dozen or so, a couple of dozen of the sailors just said, the hell with it. we're just going to go down with the ship. you know,
Yeah.
um, I just, that decision, I just wonder to myself, when does a person make that decision that you're just going to accept death? And I don't think we can answer that until we experience it.
No, and I imagine it's probably one of the most like romantic when you think about sailors going down with the ships. Like one of the romantic things that you think about is a sailor vowing to go down with the ship. And even more romantic because these are French sailors crawling back aboard and raiding the wine stores, right? And waiting until the end. But I always think like as the ship starts to sink by the stern and they're laying on the deck, drunk, hungover, whatever it is after reading the wine, once they realize it's going down, they all got up, according to the last description, and started walking forward, forward, forward until there was no place left to go. And I often wonder in those moments if they regretted the decision or whether this is the end as they meant it to be. And yeah, like you said, we'll never know about making that decision and we'll never know what they were really thinking as they went down.
A good portion of the story from here picks up with one of the lifeboats because we have a lot of testimony from them. This particular lifeboat has a number of people, passengers, and some crew, but no provisions. Tell us about their ordeal.
So writing this book, I was thinking about it, right? It's that idea that at sea you are surrounded by water that you cannot drink, right? So when you think about the effects of dehydration, you think about that thirst. You think about the freezing cold. And we've all seen stories about people like hiking mountains and they get lost in the cold and what happens. Hunger, all of that. And then you have people who start drinking seawater and they start to go a little mad. All of that going on over the span of about 7 days that these people were adrift at sea. And it's just, it's heartbreaking. It's also a little frustrating because we were talking about Victorian era French, Americans, Brits, right, in this boat. And the Victorian era was not a time when you talked about your own emotions, right, where you talked about your own personal struggles. So all of these people would say things like to imagine death in its most harrowing aspect would fail to realize the scene. Like that's what one of the passengers said. And I'm like, yeah, but I would like to realize the scene.
Yeah.
So as a writer, you're trying to say like, but I would really like to know what it is that you actually saw. And, I had made the decision in the book to only write about things that happened and reasonable inferences that I can draw from things that happened. So we'll never really know everything that happened to these folks in the boat because they did not kind of reveal it all the way we tend to do now, right? They didn't have Instagram or Facebook to tell the tales of their ordeal. But you can say it's like human suffering at the most extreme. Just the effects of all of those forces together on the body, on the mind, and they experienced all of it.
Yeah.
Some people did die. You had some people who were nearly dead as a result of this.
And we do know, as you described, that some of them resorted to drinking, or all of them resorted to drinking seawater, which was not a good plan. It's very, very deadly. And they started succumbing to the symptoms of that. But we also know of the actions of one particular crew member, especially Chapeau, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He, if there is a hero, is probably the hero of this story. So let's talk about him for a little bit.
Yeah, Jean-Marie Louis Chapeau was a simple French sailor. He had also come fresh out of the Crimean War. He served in the Navy during Crimea, got a job on the Lyonnais, like many, many of the sailors. A lot of Crimean War vets on board. And he, when we look back, because we used a lot of the information that we had about wind, about weather, about conditions to find this wreck. And we just continue to marvel at his seamanship. None of the other boats survived. Right? So you have one boat surviving, and it survived because he was such an exceptional sailor. And he was a man of, I don't want to say no distinction. I don't mean it in a negative way, but I mean no distinction aboard the ship. He wasn't a mate. He wasn't a captain. He wasn't somebody who had a rank aboard this ship. But he had this uncanny ability to read the wind and the waves, and also a very unassuming personality that sort of also kept everybody calm. And many of the passengers referenced the fact that they would not have survived this ordeal had it not been for Chapeau. And he was essentially at the helm in the beginning, the first couple of days The weather was really, really bad. I mean, we are talking what they would describe as gales. So severe, severe storms. They would not have survived were he not at the helm 24 hours a day, which almost killed him. And there is, a portion of the book where where he talks about like the physical toll that this took on him, but he very nearly died as a result of his efforts and his heroism in this.
And especially since nobody else seemed to do it. They couldn't do it. They didn't know how to do it. Every time somebody tried, they got into trouble. And to the point where they were practically lifting his lifeless body off the bottom of the boat to put him back in the seat. But I mean, he was recognized for that later via the testimony of the survivors on this boat. So, okay, so the ship sunk, and we do know that the most of the folks on this lifeboat survived and made it back to shore. Now really comes the legal aspect of the story, which is quite fascinating, really. When Captain Durham of the Adriatic gets back to port, he makes some questionable decisions, I think. But go ahead and tell us about what he was up to.
Yeah, so he, he heads to Gloucester, Massachusetts. He gets there about 2 days later and says, I got into an accident, fixed my ship. I puts himself in for repairs without ever saying I collided with another ship 2 days away that could still be in peril. And also without reporting I collided, another ship collided with me 2 days away, which I think is also telling about potentially his own feelings about his involvement in this. He didn't say somebody ran into me and ran away. He says nothing. He puts in for repairs. And then questions start to emerge. Once word that survivors are coming back, he suddenly says, oh, yeah, I collided with a ship. And then 3 sort of questions start to emerge. One is about the duty to signal, which we talked about, with the lights. One is about the duty to yield, which we talked about, right? The idea of who had the duty to yield to whom. And the other is about the duty to render aid, right? The duty to help somebody else after you've been in a collision. And there's a lot of debate, the Maine newspapers ferociously defending their captain, Captain Durham, the Massachusetts and New York papers with slightly different views. But generally, public opinion is not on Durham's side. So he leaves and he goes to France, which was where he was going. He was going to Savannah, Georgia originally to pick up a load of lime and hay and along with the timber and go to France. So he fixes his ship and he says, I'm going to go to France like I planned. So he goes to Savannah, he picks up his lime and hay, and then he heads to France, thinking that all this is going to die down while he's in France and he's going to come back and everybody will have forgotten all about it.
And of course, the French aren't happy about this. And when they find out that the captain of that ship is now in France, they send the authorities after him. So what's next for Durham? What happens to him now?
So he goes to La Ciotat, which is a city in France, discharges cargo, picks up another bit of cargo bound for Italy. And as he goes to clear customs, they say you can't leave. There's basically, I don't want to call it a warrant, but the equivalent of that in a civil case out for you. We need to straighten some things out. He finds out he's being sued by the Lyonnais for the value of the ship and for the injury to the passengers. He says that he's going to fight it. And he goes to Marseille, which is the closest city where there's an American consulate. So they called him a consul at the time. So he goes to see the American consul. In the meantime, his ship gets moved from La Ciotat to Marseille, where it's essentially arrested. The rigging is removed from the ship. It is laid up in Marseille harbor. And this was something that was happening a lot to foreign ships in Marseille. So you would have them like not paying debts or having some French having some sort of claim and them sort of getting laid up. So there's a whole group of American captains that were just kind of like waiting out the justice system in Marseille, and they would all kind of befriend one another. So he started hanging around with a group of American captains and businessmen in the maritime industry and kind of just waiting out the courts in Marseille to sort all of these things out.
And this is where he meets an interesting character, Captain Ward Smith. Yeah, he's kind of a folksy character, for at least how I perceived him. Tell us about Captain Smith, who he met in Marseille.
So Ward Smith is one of my favorite characters in this whole story. He was a captain working out of Mobile, Alabama, originally from New York, but working out of Mobile, Alabama, and had himself gotten into trouble because he had not paid some debts for repairs to his ship, and he also got stuck in Marseille. So his ship, the Saramere, is laid up in Marseille as well, and that's where he meets Captain Durham. He is so interesting. And it's so funny because one of the people who was really instrumental in helping with this book is a woman named Sharon LeDuc, who is Ward Smith's great-great-grand, I don't know how many greats there are, but grandniece. And I came across her on Ancestry.com when doing research about Ward Smith and his life. And she and I connected, and it's just incredible. And that's one of the great things about doing, nonfiction is you start to meet people who have direct connection to this. And the wonderful thing is she is a fantastic historian. She had so many records about her uncle, but also like stories that have been passed down that you wouldn't be able to read anywhere. So we would email back and forth, and we would ask questions about Ward and answer questions about Ward, which is really cool. But anyway, they become friends, and there's this kind of group of businessmen in Marseille that befriend Durham. They all hang out together, and they all kind of give each other legal advice and moral support and business advice about the predicaments that they're all in.
And of course, eventually, Captain Durham's going to have a trial. So he hires a lawyer, and they get to the actual case. Now, what was the primary charge against Durham that he had to defend against?
So it was these are civil in nature. So it's weird because later in the court process it gets kind of quasi-criminal, but in the beginning it was like a lawsuit between two companies, essentially, his and Franco-American. So the first case was tried in the Tribunal de Commerce, which is, they weren't actually judges, they were like businessmen that would adjudicate legal disputes between business people. And he won in the lower court. And then it got appealed to the appellate court, where they appointed a 3-expert panel. The court got to pick an expert, Durham got to pick an expert, and the Lyonnais, Franco-American, got to pick an expert that would kind of provide a report to the court on their behalf. They set up all these experiments in Marseille Harbor with ships the same size to see how one moved and turned, and like we basically reconstruct the accident. And again, he wins there. Right? They say, the Lyonnais really, you had the right of way. The Lyonnais should have backed down so that you could cross at the bow. And when then enters a gentleman named Ferdinand Alphonse Hamelin, who is at the time, the minister of the French Navy, who doesn't like the fact that essentially American law or common sense international rules of the sea are sort of trumping French law. And he starts complaining that everybody should have a light, and Adriatic should have carried a light, and the French carried a light, and the French are great, and starts to send bulletins out to everybody saying that these lower court decisions are a travesty. And Hamelin, remember, this is Napoleon III, so it's like 1858 now, this is Napoleon III. Hamelin speaks directly for Napoleon on all matters of the ocean. And then we get a decision from essentially the Supreme Court that reverses the lower courts and holds Durham accountable for the damage to the Lyonnais and gives him a certain time to pay up or lose his ship and or possibly do time in prison. And that's where like the weird criminal penalty comes in.
Yeah, that's probably what I was thinking of in my head. But because now they're threatening if you don't pay, you're going to be imprisoned. During all of that, during those hearings and those civil suits, public opinion was raging. In France, of course, they were very angry at Durham and the Americans. And back in the United States, they were really outraged that France had commandeered the ship and were holding him hostage, basically. So, I think public opinion was definitely part of that. More so, I'm sure the French minister of the Navy had a lot of influence. So after the lawsuit is settled, he's still stuck in Marseille, and the clock is ticking. He's got to somehow pay restitution. So what does he decide to do?
So this is where he's my I'm a criminal defense attorney, right? I have a love for these kind of plans in a weird way. So this is where he concocts a very elaborate plan to escape Marseille by transferring the rigging from Ward Smith's ship to his own ship under the guise of making repairs to the ship, and sneak it out of Marseille harbor, which he manages to accomplish by bribing a group of applying a group of sailors with liquor and sneaking them onto a ship to be his crew while they're drunk. And then passing through this very, very narrow opening. So the port of Marseille has two forts that sort of choke the opening. So you cannot get out of port without papers, showing your papers that you have clearance to pass the port. That's how you get out. So he pretends that he's another ship called La Luna. He uses, he kind of throws some fake papers that sink into the water, convinces the guard at the inspection station that he's a different ship. And it's just kind of, it's like a movie, right? It's just as he's sneaking out of the mouth of Marseille harbor, that guard looks up and realizes that this is not La Luna, this is the Adriatic, wakes everybody up. The French Navy goes after them, and then a fog sets in. And by the time the fog lifts, he is outside French maritime territory where the French Navy can no longer do anything about it. And what ensues after that is this like chase all over Europe where the French Navy keep like trying to trick him into a position where they can arrest him. And he and Ward Smith just kind of keep outsmarting them.
When I got to that part of the story and he's sneaking out of Marseille harbor, I literally started laughing like, oh my God, no, he's not. It was something out of, a fantastical movie scene that he was able to pull this off because the ship was guarded, somehow slipped past the guards, or there was a guard that didn't show up or something. And they didn't even immediately raise any sails because they thought that would be suspicious. Say they were just kind of floating across the harbor. Unbelievable. And the way that they haphazardly tried to change the name of the ship on the side, but it didn't really do a good job of it. I thought it was funny and outrageous, and that was a really fascinating part. But as you said, they start chasing him all over Europe, because then he goes to, where was it, Sicily?
He uses La Spezia in Italy. He goes to ports in Spain. Eventually, Ward Smith has to go back to Marseille because his ship's still there in port. The Sarah Mare is still in port. And they had just figured if nobody's going to know Ward Smith is with him, Ward will just go back and nobody will notice he was gone. Then everybody finds out that Ward Smith was with him. So now Ward Smith has to concoct some whole cover story too.
Yeah.
But they, and it's funny because all of that whole portion of the book comes from Ward Smith. He was just this fascinating character. He was a sailor his whole life. He retires during the Civil War. He becomes a lumber guy, a lumber distributor. He moves all over the country. And then in his 80s, he becomes a newspaper editor. He was like this Renaissance man, right? In his 80s, he becomes a newspaper editor, and he gets the job because he writes these really fascinating stories about his experiences. And one of the stories he wrote in his 80s was about his escape from France with Captain Durham. And it's funny because Sharon Leduc, the family member, had every story that he had written but that one. And I found that one in a bag inside a museum in Alabama. I pulled it out and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the story of the escape from Marseille. And I gave it to the Leduc family, but I said, please don't publish it until after the book. So they have it now. But that was one of the neat things too, is you just sense for who Ward was from his writing, and also a sense of who Durham is through Ward's eyes. And that's one of my favorite things about this book is this unlikely pair that sort of teams up, and their personalities could not be more different, but it was a perfect match for what they were trying to do.
Yeah. And, my opinion of Durham kept changing throughout the book. At first, he was definitely the villain. Then I was pulling for him. And in the end, it kind of evened out where I'm not really sure what I think of him at this point, but one thing's for sure, that his creativity and audacity and willingness to just keep trying is very evident, because his escape from Italy was equally as crazy. You'll have to read the book, I guess, to hear that story. But yeah, he eventually does escape, and nobody really knows where he is for a little while. But he's headed back across the Atlantic.
And that's where things really change, when nobody knows where he is. So while he was gone, you get this very like us versus them, right? The Americans started to be more on his side because they see this poor American laid up in France and the French sort of mistreating him in the courts. And when he's gone, all the American business people freak out because they're like, if this guy gets arrested and now goes back to France after trying to escape, American business interests in France are ruined. If he makes it, now we've essentially got like a fleeing felon on our hands. Not really, but like a fleeing culprit on our hands. So during this sort of gap between the final judgment and his return to the United States, they start having all these committee meetings. They start talking about changing the rules of the road at sea. They start complaining about the unfairness of French law applying to a collision that took place closer to America than it did to France, involving ships from different nations. So it causes this freak out, and they refer to this freak out in the media as the Adriatic Affair, which is where the title of the book comes from. But that is all ensuing around Durham's escape from France. So you see the public thinking of him originally as a villain for leaving the scene of this collision, and now starting to think of him as a hero for standing up for all the business interests of business interests traveling the high seas. So there's a big swing in public opinion about him.
Yeah, and I do think there is something to be said about the point that it was an American ship and a French ship involved in the incident. It was in international waters. So it's really not appropriate to apply French law to that incident or American law. It was just a nebulous time for maritime law, and there was really nothing to go by. So I guess, wherever court proceedings take place is what's going to be applied. But ultimately, yeah, he makes it back to the United States, and more or less nothing happens to him.
It was interesting because when he comes back, right, he testifies in Congress about what happened. He meets the president. He meets President Buchanan, although we don't have a record of what happened. But it must have satisfied him because very shortly after meeting President Buchanan, he starts taking cargo again and traveling internationally. Except to France. We don't see any more trips. So there might have been a little just stay out of France. You also have a Franco-American at that time starts to have financial difficulties. So they're no longer sort of favored in France. And the French government starts to distance themselves from this company that has some financial difficulties. And then in America, you see the Civil War. So while we see in 1958, in 1959, and even into 1960, a lot of debate and an urge in Congress to pass maritime regulations that govern collisions and signals and lights and all the things that are implicated by the Adriatic Affair, once the Civil War happens, all of that stuff just goes by the wayside because we have better things to do, right? We have a bigger political problem to focus on. And then after the Civil War, there was only one mention of the Lyonnais in the press up until the discovery, right? There's only one mention of the Lyonnais in the press that I could find after the turn of the century. And that was, I believe it was in 1920 or 1925. I might be getting my date wrong, but early in the 20th century, where they published a list of the shipwrecks from the 19th century. And a woman writes to the New York Times and says, "You forgot one. My family was on the Lyonnais. It didn't make the list." That's the only mention that I could see. So I think it was just timing. I think were it not for the Civil War, these congressional inquiries might have gone somewhere and we might have seen regulations and this shipwreck would have more significance in American history. But the intervening Civil War, everything just kind of fell by the wayside. And it isn't until after the Titanic that we start to see the kinds of regulations about lifeboats and all these kinds of things and it's not until much later that we see regulations on collisions at sea, collisions and rules and signals and things like that. So it took a while after that.
It's amazing that you even came across Le Lyonnais as a researcher, seeing that it was so unknown. Even the newspaper forgot to mention it as a wreck. But you did hear of it, and you and your team did find it, but it was not easy. Obviously, you can't tell us everything, but tell us about that process, kind of the bullet points of trying to find, as you describe it, the needle in the haystack.
So I have to say, full credit for discovering this wreck in history goes to Captain Eric Takajian. And Captain Takajian has discovered about 70 shipwrecks off the eastern seaboard. And it's just an incredible person, an incredible friend and mentor, but also someone who is meticulous with maritime history. And he came across a reference to the Lyonnais when researching the U-53 wrecks off the coast of Nantucket. And as Eric does, like tucked it away. When he reads about a ship, a file, and that file may go empty for a while. That file might get filled up. And he, keeps these files on ships. And it was one that in the 1990s, he and his team started looking for. But the problem was he was going on reported positions in newspapers, which was like 40 to 60 miles off the Nantucket shoals. And so he was looking too close to shore because he was relying on the information that he had researched at the time. And it wasn't until, Joe made the luck or love moment where Joe happens to Lyonnais. I go down this rabbit hole of research. These guys are like, we don't know what she's doing, but keep going. I don't know what I'm doing, but I keep going. And I just keep turning things over. And it was a search that from about 2015 until we found it kept driving us further east and further east to the point where the boat couldn't go that far east. So we completely reorganized our boat and repowered our boat to get further east, eventually then discovering the wreck in 2024.
When you describe that process of, oh, well, we can't go that far in our boat unless we make changes to the boat, and of course you did, I just kept thinking, oh my goodness, that's going to run into some money right there. Oh my God. All the equipment that you had to put into the boat to upgrade it just to get out to where it was located. And then, of course, the painstaking process of searching for it, searching at least a target area. The many nights and even it took a couple years or 2 to 3 years of searching, but you finally found it. Tell us about that dive there were many before that led up to it, of course, but when the time came and you thought you might have it, tell us about that particular dive.
So it's so funny because people always ask me about this moment, and I want to be able to describe this one singular moment of joy and euphoria of it. But it was that expedition in 2024 was such a roller coaster because we at first went to a site that we thought was it, and it turned out to be a different shipwreck, which we still have to identify, which is an awesome shipwreck. And I thought at that moment, this is it. We didn't find it. Some people look for wrecks their whole lives. We'll find it eventually. It's out there, telling myself it's going to be okay. And then Joe coming to me later and saying, I think I have a good feeling about another target, a target that we hadn't discussed in a year. And I'm getting so angry at him going, why are you trying to get my hopes up again? Because my hopes were just crushed. And then we went, and slowly over the course of 4 dives, we started to realize that this was the Lyonnais. So I will tell you, and it's the weirdest moment because it's not the moment you would think, but the one moment that really sticks out in my mind is after the first dive, and we didn't know that it was the Lyonnais, we just knew that it wasn't. We thought it might be a barge, and after the first dive, the guys knew it wasn't a barge. And Joe came up, he's like, I got a good feeling. I'm like, yeah, you said that yesterday. Tom came up, another diver, and he said, this looks good. He's describing iron hull plates and rivets and all sorts of things. But my friend Andrew, who is always a man of very, very few words and doesn't tell you what he thinks until long after he should, to be honest with you, comes up and he just looked at me and he said, it's not a barge. We're staying. And there was something about the way that Andrew said that made my heart flip a little bit. So it wasn't Joe, it wasn't my partner, it wasn't my friend Tom, it was my friend Andrew, and just saying something uncharacteristically optimistic that got me going. And then it was really not until the final dive when we put all the pieces together, including cylinder measurements and locations of certain objects on the wreck, and then found evidence that this was also a sailing ship. All those things coming together enabled us to label it the Lyonnais. But if there's a moment that kind of sticks out of my mind that I thought we were onto something, it was really that weird moment with Andrew. It's we're staying. And I was like, oh, Andrew thinks there's something here.
Well, it had to be exciting, or at least a relief to know that after all of your research and all of your effort going back many, many years now, you finally found it. You had confirmation that this virtually unknown wreck, but very significant wreck, where a lot of people lost their lives have been found. Just that moment of relief and just, maybe a little bit of exoneration almost, all this work is paid off finally. So what kind of objects have you discovered from the wreck that are of interest?
So we did bring up some immediately when they went down. They found portholes, which can be helpful in determining the age of a wreck. So we brought those up to take a look at them and determine that they were of the right period. We haven't really touched a lot of it. Part of the reason is, you're out there, we're watching a weather window. We have limited dives. We were really focused on all the dives on the identification. And most of that dealt with staying around the engine where you're going to have the most material. Remember, this is 1856. The wreck is significantly buried. There's not a lot of stuff exposed. And engines and measurements and locations of objects like, capstans and engines and donkey engines and all of these things that we saw in the historical records were going to help us identify it. So that's why I always joke, we don't really have a lot of pretty pictures of the Lyonnais. I got a lot of pictures of engine cylinders, right? We're taking pictures of parts and pieces of the wreck. So there's certainly a lot more documentation and exploration to do, like following it out to go to the bow, following it out to go to the stern section, maybe starting to go through a little bit more deliberately, fan away some of the sand and start to see what's down there. So I'm hopeful that when we get back out there, we'll be able to report some more pretty pictures and at least have a better survey. When we found this wreck, we were using side scan sonar on all of these searches, and our scan of this is pretty ugly because we had terrible weather. Hurricane had just passed through. The seas were really running rough. We were scanning in horrible weather. I remember I was sitting backwards, staring at his computer screen for hours on really rough seas. So our scan is terrible. So we'd also like to be able to, side scan the site and get a nice, clean side scan sonar image of the debris down there to better plan where we want to go next and what we want to do next.
Well, so you have some more work to do with the Lyonnais, but what else is on tap for DV Tenacious?
So the other thing that is on tap is that other shipwreck that I mentioned. We thought we had done some side scan imaging in 2023, thought that this one particular wreck was the Lyonnais. It looked good as a sonar target. And when we went to dive it, that was our first dive out there last summer. It was not it. It was a wreck with a compound steam engine, a vertical steam engine, a pretty spectacular steam engine that's standing upright underwater. It's really cool. We don't know what it is. We think 1880s to 1920s in that time period. So we need to go out and figure out what that is. We had also surveyed another shipwreck that we are fairly certain is not a barge that is out there that we need to dive and take a look at. So there's a couple other wrecks out there that we want to have a go at. That's probably the biggest priority, is figuring out, we call that one the big engine steamer because the engine's big, but we'd love to know what the big engine steamer is. And there's some photos of that actually in the book as well.
Well, where can everybody keep up with you and your team to see what you're up to?
So we have our Facebook and Instagram is at DV Tenacious. So D like dive, V like vessel, Tenacious. And so we post regular updates about things that we're doing on there, about tech diving generally, maritime history. And then the book is called The Adriatic Affair, Maritime Hit and Run off the coast of Nantucket. And that is available at Amazon and wherever fine books are sold. But right now, Amazon still, like I mentioned, it's not in a ton of bookstores because the first edition sold out and a lot of bookstores weren't able to get their shipments until the next edition arrives. So Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, places like that are really the best bet right now. And I'm always posting on our Facebook page if we're doing any presentations or anything about it anywhere. So if you're interested in coming and seeing photos and video and hearing the presentation, that stuff is always posted on our Facebook page.
Yeah. Well, outstanding work, both in the writing and the research and physically finding the wreck. I mean, that's just, I'm so impressed. And I can't recommend the book enough. So please, everyone, go out there and get it. It's worth every penny. It's a fantastic story, beautifully written, and you won't regret it. I promise. Jen, thank you so much for joining me again. And I can't wait to hear what's next.
Thank you.